Welcome to this session of the 2020 Online Wantage Literary Festival. My name's Gary Sheffield. I am Professor of War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton and I live in Wantage, hence my connection with the Wantage Literary Festival. I'm really pleased today to introduce Rebecca Clifford, who is the author of this book, Survivors: Children's Lives After the Holocaust. I must say, having read it over the last couple of weeks, it's one of the mostly toughest reads I've had in quite some time, but it's an extremely rewarding book, fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing it with Rebecca. So, start off with a very straightforward question. Rebecca, would you like to introduce yourself? What's your background? And how did you come to write this book?
Sure. It's breaking my heart a little bit, Gary, that you found it a tough read because fingers crossed, I like to think that everybody's actually going to find it a read where they just can't stop turning the pages.
No,
I understand what you mean.
I actually did pick it up and I read it and I read it and I read it and I could not put it down. It's just the subject matter is just...
Sure.
I mean, I think I have a bad time researching military history and mass battles and things like that, but yeah.
Well, maybe I can work something about that into what I'm about to say. So I'm Rebecca Clifford. I'm a historian at Swansea University. As you can probably also hear from my accent, I'm originally Canadian, but I have lived in the UK for almost 20 years and also consider myself to be British. And the question of how and why I wrote the book is a bit of a complex one because there's multiple facets, I guess, to the answer. But maybe the most, if I stick with explaining the academic or intellectual reason why I tackled this book, it might surprise you actually, because it didn't, although I am a Holocaust scholar by training, I've worked on the Holocaust for 20 years now, that wasn't the rationale behind my wanting to write this book. I have worked for a very long time as an oral historian, and oral historians do their work by interviewing people about the past. And I have a very, simple technique when I do that. I simply go to people and I say, tell me your life story. And when I was working on a previous project, I thought a lot about how and where and in what way people start their stories, because I was doing a lot of interviews for this project, sort of we did 50 or 60. And so I heard a lot of people start their life stories. And I thought, everybody starts their story in the same place. Everyone explains who their parents were, where they were born, the communities they grew up in. That's how human beings start their stories. And I started to think, okay, well, what if you couldn't start your story in that place? How would you make sense of your life? And I thought about, what kind of groups might struggle to tell the story of their earliest years. And it occurred to me that no one had really studied child Holocaust survivors and how they dealt with that issue, because many did not know how to answer those very basic questions. So that is what spurred me to want to write this book. I think I had that as a very vague idea at the beginning. Of course, it evolved and became a book where I actually looked at how child Holocaust survivors tried to answer that question of who am I at different points in their lives. So as teenagers and as young adults and as they matured and as they entered old age. And that was very, very rewarding to see that they, and I suspect all of us, tell our own life stories really differently at different points as we grow and as the world around us changes.
And that was something actually I found fascinating by your book, in which people came to discover more about their past, sometimes discover a completely unknown background and come to terms with it. But we'll speak some more about that later on. You hinted there's something other than a purely academic reason for...
I did, and I don't want to hide it. It's just not part of the book. So there's also a background reason. My mother is a child survivor of the Holocaust. She's an infant survivor. So she was born in 1944 and in Budapest. Of course, that has a major influence on me. And there's a way in which, I also wrote the book to understand my own family better, to understand my mother and the relationship between us. But I was very careful to keep my family story out of this book, partly because I'd really like to write another book on it one day. So I'm sort of holding it aside. And also because I never wanted my story to impose on the stories here. This book is about the children in this book, and
Yeah, no,
I didn't want to get in the way.
that's really, no, that's really interesting, because I didn't know that. It's reading the book. I guess that you were just someone who came in, as a disinterested outsider, but it's really interesting to know that. And I must say, you did keep yourself up in very much an admirable way. I can also identify with not wanting to let your own emotions get too bound up. And I've actually found that, oddly enough, as a historian of the First World War, I can distance myself. As the Second World War, less so, because I didn't really know any family members who actually were adults in the First World War. I did with the Second World War, and I found it much more difficult to separate myself. But no, that's not going off down a rabbit hole. Okay, well, this is the really, really difficult bit. Can you give us very briefly, what's your book about? What are its USPs? So,
okay, I kind of gave some of it away already, I think. There's the simple and the more complex answer. So in the simple answer, the book is about children who survived the Holocaust. It looks at their entire lives from 1945. I mean, there's a bit about what happened during the war, but I'm really interested in the aftermath, as it were. So it's kind of from 1945 straight through to the present. It looks at how they try to make sense of these childhoods, and so often they didn't know anything about their own childhoods, or they knew very little, or they had sketchy memories. I should add that all because I wanted to answer that question. How do you tell the story of your life if you don't know where you came from? The book really focuses on very young children. So there's 100 children in the book, and every one of them was born between 1935 and 1944, which means none of them were older than 10 when the war finished. And that was important to me because young children remember in a very specific way, often a very fragmented way, and it's hard to make a logical story out of it. So I wanted to have children who had the experience of living through persecution in Europe during the war years, but who couldn't really remember what happened to them. So it was like a basic part of the fabric of their being, but they couldn't piece it together. And there was often nobody left after the war who could explain it to them, or who was willing to, because many adults did not want to talk about what had happened. So that in a nutshell is what the book is about. But I always think of the book as really fundamentally being about how we tell the story of our lives. So this is a group that had a very extreme experience. And so they're a good example for probing this question. But I'm really hoping that many different people will pick up the book and see something of their own experiences reflected in it.
I must say, it made me think about my earliest memories, and it did. And also, actually, I must say, just I can see how the techniques that you use are applicable to my very different study of people who are involved in some of the big conflicts of the 20th century. So no, it was a real eye-opener in many ways. Okay, let's just step back a bit. For those people who maybe are not quite sure of the terms that we're using, what actually was the Holocaust? How many people were involved? Did it only involve Jewish people or other people? So perhaps you could give some of the broad background.
Those are the hardest questions to answer in a way, Gary, because we don't agree on definitions, I think, as historians. I use the word Holocaust to mean the systematic and industrial murder of Jewish children, women, and men during that period. Well, from the period basically when gosh, you could go far back, from the period when anti-Jewish laws were introduced through to the liberation. How many people were involved? What countries were involved? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by involved. In terms of how many Jewish people were murdered, it was established at Nuremberg during the Nuremberg trials that it was roughly 6 million, which is a figure that is so big that is impossible to take on, really. And in terms of which countries were involved, I think it's very important to emphasize that every country in Europe was involved in some way, even the neutral countries. If you see involved as being also possibly a place of rescue or refuge, or involved is a very complex term. So you need to think of the Holocaust as being an absolutely pan-European phenomenon.
And I guess if we take people involved as not simply those who were murdered, but those who were affected in some way, what are we talking, double numbers, triple numbers, quadruple numbers? I mean, just impossible to
if you think of involved as the people who were murdered, the people who watched, the people who did the murdering, then almost everybody is involved in some way. And you did ask the question of whether the Holocaust involves non-Jewish people, and that is a very, very interesting matter of debate, one that's so complex and has its own history that I kind of don't want to get into the whole thing.
That's fine.
The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is really important authority on these questions, it takes a very broad definition. It includes non-Jewish people who were persecuted because they were considered by the Nazis to be racially inferior. For example, Roma peoples, some Slavic peoples, Russian prisoners of war would be other people in that category. If you think instead of who you might have seen if you had gone to a concentration camp, a Nazi concentration camp, you would have also seen those being interned and murdered because of their political beliefs. So especially communists, socialists, also those who had certain religious beliefs like Jehovah's Witnesses, and those who had certain sexual practices such as homosexuals were also interned. So I guess, you know, how do you define, if you want to define Holocaust as all those who were racially persecuted, all those who were persecuted, the numbers balloon and balloon. I think it's hard enough to understand 6 million, but we would then be talking about 11, 12 million people.
Let's just stick to the 6 million for simplicity's sake.
Well, I actually think, I mean, it's in a way we have ended up, when we talk in education, we talk so much about the Holocaust, we forget that there were other people in concentration camps, and that can be problematic too. But usually when I talk about the Holocaust with my students, I'm specifically talking about the persecution of
Sure.
Jews.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to sort of get our definition straight at the beginning. Okay, well, methodology, to use a boring academic term, really, how did you go about writing this book? Where did you get the evidence from? I mean, it's fascinating, but where did you get it from?
So it was hard. I mean, it's always hard. Every time historians go into the archives, it's a good, hard slog, but this was particularly hard. And it won't surprise anyone to hear the reason why. The book is about children, although obviously it follows children right into their old age, but it starts with people who are children, and children don't leave very much in the archives. And that's because archivists, we don't see what children create as being valuable enough to archive. So the book really tries very hard to try to get not at what adults thought children needed in 1945, for example, but what children themselves wanted and needed. That was a bit of an elusive task in many ways. It was never going to be complete because children don't leave a very big record. But I did go through many, many archives all over the world. I found a lot of reports written by adults about what children seemed to want and need, which I take with a grain of salt. And I sometimes found very, very precious to me documents created by children. I can very, very briefly show you the shape of these if you like.
Please.
So I shall share my screen. So sometimes, can you see this now?
Yes.
Great. This is a letter written by a girl, I think she was about 11 years old at the time. The date's not on it exactly when it says Taverny, the 18th of January, 1951, I think it was. So this is a girl who, she was born in Germany, and she was deported at a very young age to an internment camp in the south of France. She was then smuggled out of that camp by an aid organization, and her parents were deported to Auschwitz and murdered, but she and her sister managed to survive in hiding in France. After the war was over, she was taken from the home where she had been hiding, which it's important to say she very, very much loved the woman who protected her during the war, and this is a letter to that woman. She was taken out of that home, as were all children in hiding in France, and Jewish children in hiding, and placed with a Jewish aid organization called the Ose in a care home, which she also was very happy in, I have to add. in this letter, she's writing to this beloved woman who rescued her during the war. The reason I wanted to show you this letter is because I think it flags up not just the fact that you occasionally find letters by children in the archives, and they're very precious, but the way which we also might be careful in using them, because we have to think what, children write letters. How far are they being told what to write by an adult? How far is it a choice that they make themselves? How far do they understand what's going on around them? So anybody who can read French has probably already read the letter. You'll see that the girl says, oh, we were very happy to get your letter, and it's being cold here, and we went to the swimming pool and we watched some films. And in the middle of it, she says, we won't be able to come and see you this year. She's talking about herself and her sister, because we're leaving for America on the 23rd of January. I can never know, as a historian looking at this letter, how far she understood what was happening to her, because she was being sent into immigration, never to return, not to see this woman again until she was a grown woman herself, not to see the other children and the members of staff in the care home which she loved, being sent into a very frightening journey, actually, which deeply shaped her. And the kind of blithe way she drops it in the letter makes me think, did she not know, or did she want to conceal her own fear? There's a lot of questions sort of in the letters children produce. You might also, if you're lucky, in the archives find paintings and drawings by children. There are a small handful. I should add, both these documents are from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum collection. Here's a fabulous picture, which is in the book, of a young woman, a girl, and her family, presumably, preparing a table for Sukkot. And so you can guess that maybe this is a younger brother and this is a mother. Well, this is a painting. It was painted by a girl who was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was living at that time in a care home in England, and she's painting this happy family scene. And I think there are so many scenes like this in the archives. It's hard to know how to analyze them as a historian. What do we make of it? Is this simply, she was told to paint a happy scene and this is what she painted? Or is there a kind of longing for family here? It's hard to analyze, hard to parse these documents. But for all that, I think we have to try. So I found that probably the most challenging aspect of the project, but so exciting when you find something that a child made themselves in the archives. I should also add that I would look for children in the archives, basically. I often went through using their case files or case reports about individual children. And then I would search and see if those children had ever given a later oral history interview. And if I could track them down myself, I interviewed them myself. So I did interviews of my own for the book. I also used existing interviews. But it's worth saying that, of course, you can talk to someone about their childhood, but that doesn't tell you what children think. It doesn't tell you what that person thought or wanted or believed when they were a child, because we don't hold on to those things. So it is a way in. It tells us something, but it doesn't give us unmediated access to a child's beliefs. Those things kind of remain difficult to grasp.
Well, one of the stories that you told, which I found particularly interesting, was the story of Jackie Y. I think that you had to give them pseudonyms, or at least disguise the surnames as part of your conditions for getting access to the material. And to quote your book, he says he grew up thinking he was an average North London Jewish kid, but he discovered, to his amazement, that as a very small child, he'd been in a concentration camp. Now, what does Jackie's story tell us about the problems that very young child survivors faced in coming to terms with a past which might be almost entirely forgotten? Yeah.
Jackie's story, anyone who reads the book will see that I love Jackie's story, and I hope Jackie will watch this. So hi, Jackie.
Well, I must say I was really taken by him, and I only hope that he supports the right team in North London, the one that wears red. But there you go.
I will let him come back to you on that himself. Jackie's story is amazing, partly why I wove it into the book so much. But what I'm really hoping is that he will actually publish his memoirs, because he writes beautifully, and he has a unique way of thinking through some of these issues. And He's very honest. So I interviewed Jackie, and we're in correspondence, but actually a lot of the material used in the book comes from his own memoir, his own unpublished memoir. And he writes so beautifully about how the slow trickle of discovering who he was, of having these fuzzy memories and sometimes these dreams of places. And he'd ask his parents, his parents, who he at first did not know were his adopted parents, and they'd say, oh, everybody has dreams like that. And yet these images were kind of haunting him. They were in the background. And then, so there's a sort of slow trickle that first he learns he's adopted, and he accepts this fact. I think he's about 10 years old when he learns. And then he learns that he's not only adopted, but he was foreign born. That one's a bit more of a shocker. And he starts to think, what else do I not know? And this revelation about having come from a concentration camp doesn't happen until he's getting married. So he, I think, is just at the end of his teens or in his early 20s at that point. And to get married in a synagogue, you have to prove that you're Jewish. And the most obvious way you can do that is by proving that your mother was Jewish. So he and his wife-to-be, they are going to the synagogue, they're speaking to the authorities, and the authorities at the synagogue are saying, well, we need proof that your mother was Jewish. And Jackie's adopted mother says, oh, I've got the proof. I'll get it. And it's in the safety deposit box. And Jackie's thinking, what on earth is this? So she goes to the safety deposit box. She comes back with a slip of paper. She hands it to the, secretary of the shul, of the synagogue. And when that person is handing it back, Jackie snatches it, feeling, this is my past. I have a right to it. And he's absolutely stunned to see this bit of paper that says that he was in a concentration camp. So you can imagine the tidal wave of shock that hits him, and the the feeling that, of course, both he's completely shocked, and in a way it makes sense of all the other things that didn't make sense in his past is kind of coming together. Many child survivors describe a moment like that. I think, getting back to your question, that Jackie's story hammers home how much child survivors, but actually all of us, need to know where we came from, and how when and if you don't, it's like an insistent drum banging away at the back of your life. You will want to know. And if you, like Jackie, have had the past hidden from you deliberately, but not unkindly, I add, I am sure that Jackie's parents genuinely wanted to protect him from the shocking knowledge of where he came from. But it is, even if it was well meant, it was a very difficult and a traumatic thing to put children through, to hide their pasts from them.
I seem to remember, correct me if I'm wrong, it's Jackie who was dreaming about this big country house with a drive going down to a lake or a swimming pool.
That's right.
And then he goes and finds this place, and it's a place near Lingfield in Surrey, which was a home for child Holocaust.
That's right. Yes. So in August of 1945, so 75 years ago last month, 300 child survivors of different concentration camps, mostly Theresienstadt though, were brought to Britain as part of a scheme to bring child concentration camp survivors into the country. And Jackie was one of the very youngest group, the group of infants who came in that group. So he was housed briefly in a sort of special care home for the 6 infants who came in that group. And then later on, with a really amazing matron named Alice Goldberger, who cared for a small group of very young child concentration camp survivors who had been brought to Britain. But he was young enough when he was adopted that he really didn't have clear memories of that time. And so Alice, the care home where Alice Goldberger was a matron, was in Lingfield, as you say. The care home was called, it was in a manor house called Weir Courtney. So it was called Weir Courtney as well. And so I think he was about 5 when he was adopted. So he had these fuzzy memories of this beautiful country house. And there was a racetrack, of course, which is the Lingfield racetrack. And he remembered it, but didn't remember it. It was so fuzzy that it could have been a dream. All of us can understand that because we have memories from our childhood that are like that, where you think, was that a dream? Did it really happen? So assumed it was a dream. And when he asked his mother, she would say, oh, no, it's just a dream. And then when he was, I think before he got married, he was out having a drive with his fiance. They were just driving around on some country roads, and they happened to drive into Lingfield. And he looked out and he saw the scene from his dream. And it was true. That's what's really shocking about Jackie's story. It was true. It tells you so much about, you know, memories of childhood, how we remember in this dreamlike and fragmentary way, and we all do that. And if our memories from those early years are concrete, it's because somebody explained them to us later, you know, our parents usually.
Yes, and also, of course, often people think they're remembering things, they're actually remembering photographs.
That's right. So if you didn't have the photographs, you will remember differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, I mean, this I think brings us on to one of the things that I found most fascinating of a truly fascinating book, just the different ways that and problems that child survivors had in adjusting to a very different sort of life. So we talked about Jackie, you know, who had effectively no memory of the concentration camp, but of course, older children remembered all too well what it was like. And saw the most appalling things with their own eyes. How did they cope in their different ways with growing up and trying to live, you know, in inverted commas, a normal life?
Yeah. I should actually say, first off, that because there are no older children in the book, I keep thinking that older children deserve their own book, and maybe I'm going to get around to writing that, because I think it's very, very different if you remember the concentration camp clearly. And not, even though the oldest of the children in my book are 10 at the time of liberation, there's very, very few of them who have really clear memories of being in a camp.
Okay. Yeah.
But I guess one of the things that writing this book really brought home to me was that we often think, and we even in our teaching talk about the liberation 1945 as a kind of happy moment, right? The war is over and it's sort of a celebration. And when you see images of the liberation, they're often like, yay, flag waving, and everybody's dancing in the streets. And for so many people in Europe, and not just Jewish people, the liberation was a terrible, uncertain, terrifying, dark moment when there was no housing and your possessions had been taken and you had no job and no way back to your old life. And suddenly, you know, through the war, and this is true for adults and children, they're just trying to survive and keep it together day to day. The liberation comes and suddenly the penny drops. There's no home to go back to. The parents are not coming back. The siblings are gone forever. The community is gone. I don't even speak the language of that community anymore. All these things, children like adults had to realize in the summer of 1945. And I think that was extraordinarily difficult. And that went on and on. I mean, there's another thing that the book really brought home to me, is that there was a long, long tale of uncertainty. And the war, for these children, the war just continued. Or some of them actually said, that's when the war started for me. During the war, I was okay. You know, I was with a rescue family. They loved me. They were taking care of me. I felt all right. I felt protected. The war ends and all of that ends. And then there's just this long, long period when you're waiting, thinking, are my parents still alive? Might they turn up? Are they gone forever? When will I know? 10 years? I mean, and people were trickling back from the far reaches of the Soviet Union, for example, for years and years and years. It was a very, very uncertain period. So I think children struggled to cope in many ways. They struggled because they lost, I know this will sound very weird, but they lost the normalcy of the wartime. And even a concentration camp could feel very normal to a little kid who had never known anything else. I think that's hard for us to believe, but many of the people in the book say that.
I mean, it's slightly trite comparison, but in the middle of a pandemic now, we've been in it 6 months, and somehow this strange situation has become to feel normal, hasn't it? So I can quite see how the very abnormal circumstances the war might appear to be normal. I mean, building on what you've already said, I mean, one of the really striking and actually quite upsetting things that you said was that actually children in care homes in many cases fared better those than who were reunited with their family. And that seems so counterintuitive, but you offer some very compelling evidence that was so. So perhaps you'd like to talk us through that.
Sure. I have to say it was counterintuitive and upsetting for me too.
Mm.
And that just really exposed how deeply I and most of us believe that the family is best, and nothing could be better than having your family survive and getting back together again. It just, we've all, if you've ever seen the film Life is Beautiful, of course it ends with the scene of the little boy finding his mother again, and they run into each other's arms and they say, "We won," because they survived. And that's what we want to believe family reunification was like after the war. But the reality is not hard to understand, I think. Jewish families, and many other non-Jewish families in Europe at this time too, Jewish families were in a very precarious position. First of all, that parents had been through their own experiences sometimes of internment or concentration camps or traumatic experiences. They came back to maybe wherever they were from to find they had no home. Their neighbors had taken their furniture and their clothing. They had no jobs to go back to. They had literally no resources to feed their children or to feed themselves or to start to rebuild their lives. And children can become really a great burden in a situation like that. And there was a huge amount of movement. So there's a deep instability. But for children in care homes, the care homes that were opened to help child survivors were really, in many ways, very radical places. This is across Europe. Oh, of course, there was bad ones too, but many of them were, they had really very radical ideas about how to care for children. And they were funded by external bodies like, for example, the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which was bringing in money from the United States to make sure that children in care homes had enough to eat and had a lovely place to live. And I think more important than material concerns, the adults who were working in those homes were often survivors themselves. But because they didn't have to scrounge around and try to put their life back together, they often felt they had a real sense of mission to devote themselves 100% to the care of these children. So in care homes, children often encountered very devoted adults at home with their own parent, because they were more likely to be reunified with a single parent than both. They often had a very, the scattered attention of a traumatized adult. Seen in that way, it's not a surprise that many were much happier in care homes than with their own parents.
One final question before we move on to some questions which people have sent in. It used to be said that there was a great silence about the Holocaust in the 50s and 60s. People just weren't talking about it. Well, this is exactly the period when child survivors were going through adolescence and into early adulthood. Well, your book casts extreme doubt on this idea of this silence about the Holocaust. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about that. First of all, where did this idea of this great silence come from, and how has it started to be unpicked?
So I can't claim responsibility for doing that, because there's been a really amazing wave of historians steadily unpicking that thesis for many years now. I think it's born of the fact that there's an enormous amount of public interest in the Holocaust that starts from the 1970s onwards. And because what comes later is so massive in a way, it makes everything that came before look small in comparison. But if we put what comes later aside and go back and look at the 50s and the 60s, we actually can see a lot going on there in many different countries, both in a public format and within Jewish communities. But I do things a little differently in the book, I suppose. I say, why don't we look inside the intimate sphere of the home? Whether it's the care home or, the familial home or the adoptive familial home, look in the home and see what kind of conversations people are having, and we'll have a different sense of what that silence looked like. And so it is maybe not a surprise to think, well, okay, we've got these child survivors like Jackie who had a lot about their past hidden from them. It should be no surprise then that becomes a sort of sticking point in families when those children become teenagers, because that's what teenagers do. Teenagers are trying to figure out who they are. It's fundamentally part of the experience of being an adolescent. And so we find a lot of stories in the book of teenagers challenging their families, saying, I want to know more. And I also want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to what happened to me, because they hadn't been listened to. There's a wonderful story that I start the book with, the story of a girl, a woman named Litzy S. She is also in a care home. It actually is the same care home that Jackie was in Lingfield. She's in this home, and one day a man and woman come by and they meet her, and maybe they come a couple of times, and at some point they say, the man says, "I'm your father, and this lady is your mother, and we'd like to bring you home to live with us." And at that particular point of the children living in that care home, no one else had a father or mother turn up. As time went on, their families, but Litzy was the first one, so it must have been really very exciting, not just for her but for the other children, because here was evidence parents could come back. So she goes home with this couple and she lives with them and she gets going on a normal life, I suppose. And at some point the family immigrate to Australia. It's a difficult time for them. Litzy starts to wonder things like, why do you have no photos of me as a baby? And her mother's sort of evasive about the answer. And she's got memories that don't make sense. These memories of, well, she describes it so beautifully herself. She's a memory where the predominant feeling of the memory is wood, of wood you can get a splinter from. And she's remembering, she's probably remembering the bunks that she slept in when she was in the concentration camp at Theresienstadt. But no one can explain this to her, so she tries to put it aside. And when she's at sort of in her late teens, she's having a row with her dad, and they're screaming at each other. Oh, obviously teenagers and their parents do this. And they're screaming at each other, and in her anger, she yells, "I wish you weren't my father." And he says, "I'm not." And so in this moment, a bit like Jackie ripping that piece of paper out of his mother's hand, Litzy both has this terrible shock and also feels like, now it all makes sense. It all makes sense. And it all starts coming out at that point. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she's a teenager, right? These are conversations that children have, teenagers have with their parents. So this is happening in the 1950s, and I also talk a bit about the 1960s, when many of these child survivors were, young adults with children of their own. But if we look inside the house, inside the home, then we find these sort of fraught conversations happening. And as child survivors age, these happen at very important moments, especially at moments, for example, when their own children are born, and that makes them reflect on parents they never knew, or when they get divorced and they start to think, am I having trouble with, separation? Or all these things come up in their lives at kind of key, what you would think of as major life moments, I suppose. And this was happening through the 50s and the 60s. And it helps us think about, the nature of silence as being something quite a bit more complex.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating. Well, before we finish, I've just got a few questions which have been sent in from various people. Perhaps if we can keep the answers quite short, because I'd like to get through 2 or 3 if we could. The first one is from Andy Cochran, and he asks about the kinder transport, which you don't deal with in the book, but it struck me as being a really interesting question. What was the significant effect of the Holocaust between survivors that you've been talking about and those on the kinder transport who got out before the war started? So both, I guess, Holocaust victims, but in a very different way.
Absolutely. I think, because we're keeping the answer short, I think ultimately, if you got a group of child Holocaust survivors together with kinder transport children, who are also Holocaust survivors in another way, you would find if you looked at the whole course of their lives, I think you would find their experiences broadly similar. The only really significant difference is that the children in my book lived through a moment of persecution on the European continent. Sometimes they don't remember it clearly, but they did live through it. The kinder transport obviously got out of Europe into very different conditions, often had very, very traumatic experiences during the war as well. I think really it would make sense to just look at the group and say they share probably way more in common than they have different.
Thank you. Okay. Well, next one, a really interesting question from Linda Parker, who's a regular contributor to the Wantage Literary Festival, and she talks about whether survivors talked more about their experiences in their old age. And she compares this to soldiers of the First World War, like Harry Patch, who didn't really talk about his experiences until very, very late in life. Is that also true for child survivors of the Holocaust?
It is absolutely true, but I think we have to be careful about why this happens. It's my opinion that it happens not because there's some natural desire to get things out as you enter old age, although that is true for some people, but it's because the difference is they're asked. They're asked now, and they weren't asked for 30 years ago. And, you know, having an audience for your story makes all the difference. It's hard to tell your story if nobody wants to listen.
And actually, there's a direct parallel from that and veterans of the two world wars, of course, where, you know,
that's right.
Of course, there's been a boom in oral history over the last 30 or so years, and all sorts of people have told the stories who would have been ignored otherwise. So no, I can quite see that's the case. Another question from Linda is about faith. Did the experiences of these child Holocaust survivors lead to them moving away from their Jewish roots, or serve to reinforce them?
There is no pattern there. Many swung towards a very Orthodox Judaism, others abandoned it entirely. And I think it probably made a difference simply what happened in the immediate post-war period. Because a lot of those Jewish care homes, the ones funded by the American Joint Distribution Committee, they were Orthodox Jewish, or they were in some way, you know, Jewish identity and Jewish religious practice was very much a core of their being. So a child who ended up in one of those care homes was far more likely to continue to practice Judaism throughout their lives than a child who went back to traumatized parents who said, well, why would I ever go back to Judaism? It's not safe, which indeed is what happened in my own family. I think that for many of the child survivors, as they passed through life, they struggled with some of these issues of identity because return to Judaism did not always feel safe. And sometimes it's just very practical things, you know, for women, for example, who married into Orthodox families. If they'd grown up in a care home, then they'd never learned the kosher rules for the kitchen, and were kind of embarrassed by the holes, because of course, not knowing something like that exposes the bigger things you don't know, I suppose. So it's a very I mean, individuals dealt with that in different ways, but a really very difficult issue, I think, is that of identity.
I guess another thing, I think you touched on this in your book to some extent. Of course, some of these survivors ended up in Israel, so presumably some of them would have become Zionists.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, some of them, quite a few of them, ended up in Israel, ended up living in the kibbutz system. Some of them still do live there. I think we had a plan to talk about what happened to children in the immediate aftermath of the war, and we haven't talked about that, and that's fine. We'll leave it off. But of course, some of them end up trying to enter Palestine illegally before it's Israel, and end up in a very complicated situation there. But there's a good handful of survivors in the book who lived their lives in Israel and had a range of experiences, I suppose.
So frustrating. We could talk for about 3 hours on your book. But the very last question, and this is actually from Vicky, our literary festival organizer. She asked a really interesting question about what happened to the assets and property that was rightfully returned to descendants of Holocaust survivors. Did anybody of your subjects get caught up in disputes about houses and bank accounts and things like that?
Nobody that I talked to of the 100 children in the study. Of that 100, I should say, I interviewed 20 something myself, 23, 25. So the rest of the interviews were existing interviews. So some of the children I've never met them in person. I can't think of anyone who talked about a property dispute or a belongings dispute. I think we have to assume that most of these children, obviously now in their 80s and 70s, came from, working class or middle class families. They did not come from powerful families, and they never had the resources to try to reclaim their possessions. They couldn't even identify their possessions. And actually, I think it's probably true for most Jewish survivors that those things that were lost in terms of material possession never came back again.
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. It's, I must say, it's been a very real privilege to speak to you about this. This is as I said at the beginning, I found the book, it put me through the emotional ringer reading it, but in a good way. I must say, at the end, I really felt, sounds like a terrible cliche, but I'm glad I read the book, because in the end, I think it is sort of almost life-affirming to see that people can come out the far side of these most appalling experiences and make something of their lives. It's not to say there was happy ever after endings for everybody, far from it, but nonetheless, by the time I finished the book, I'd actually sort of thought this is a book I thought well worth reading, not purely in an academic sense, although it is, but actually it's something which sort of, appealed to me emotionally and made me think differently about some things. So I'm starting to witter, so I'll shut up at this point. But it's an absolutely perfect book.
You're looking for it. I've got it.
I've put it down somewhere, which is
here. It is.
Okay, even better. Desperately searching for my copy in my very untidy study. Let me just say to anybody who's watching this on YouTube, very much hope that you've enjoyed this session. Please do go out and buy the book, read the book. It's extremely worthwhile. In terms of keeping the Wantage Literary Festival going, if you feel that you want to donate to us, please go online to wantageliteraryfestival.co.uk and make a donation. And next year, we will be back, hopefully, in a face-to-face question. So I'll be interviewing, if not Rebecca, somebody like her, face-to-face at the Beacon in Wantage, running between the 23rd and the 30th of October, 2021. So again, Rebecca, thanks ever so much indeed. Thanks ever so much for not only for a really, really interesting discussion, but actually a really excellent and thought-provoking book.
Thanks
Thank you very
so much,
indeed.
Gary, and thanks, Vicky, as well.